I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. It's a trumpet. No, it's an apron. No, it's a man's face. We spend a lot of time examining small details within Mormon history, and it's really easy to lose sight of the entire picture. Well, there's a trade-off here. We can root around in the mud and the muck covering the valleys of deep Mormon history, but that can only be done at the sacrifice of losing sight of the mountaintops. We could remain on the mountaintops and look into the valleys of deeper history, but the finer details where nuanced conversations happen are left too vague to understand that nuance. So what's the solution when we find ourselves lost in the historical valleys without the mountaintops in sight? Well, we take an airlift extraction out and navigate our way with some new foresight. Now, this belabored analogy, it's my way of saying, let's review how we got to where we are in Mormon history. I frequently make the mistake of thinking that everybody listening is working with the same set of information in their brain as I am. I'm trying to be the tour guide here, but I too often don't acknowledge that tour guides are there because the people on the tour are completely unfamiliar with the territory. Let's discuss the journey so far. What we're going to do today is hit the high-level points of Mormon history that we've discussed throughout the history of this show, and I'm going to refer you to which episodes in the backlog that go through the deeper dive of each of those points. There's also stuff that we've missed that will be discussed eventually when they fit into the subject matter of future episodes. The Greek Psalter incident is a subject that stands out to me that we've yet to discuss, but I'm going to find a good spot for it in the timeline moving forward. So let's get started. How did we get to where we are? So when this podcast began, it was the early life of Joseph Smith. That's episode 1. Now, all of episode 1, and for most of the subsequent episodes concerning Joseph Smith's early life, they all come from Lucy Mack Smith, and she recounted it in 1845. That's not necessarily considered a trustworthy source or an unbiased, objective reporter of the facts. It's just always worth keeping in mind the sources that we can trust as opposed to the ones that are, a bit more conjectural. Lucy Mack Smith is definitely one of those. Then we get into Emma Hale. She was introduced in episode 2. Now, I did a terrible job of introducing her, but, when I started, I had yet to read her biography or any papers about her, when I did that episode. So I've tried to remedy those oversights with episodes 107, 108, when Emma enters the sphere as president of the Relief Society. So that's, just a basic rundown of what you can find in episode 2. Now, the majority of the first 10 history episodes were introducing prominent figures into the timeline. We have David Whitmer, Martin Harris, Oliver Cowdery. Each of those people had their own episodes. Joe's early life, though, is hotly controversial and ripe for speculation. You see, so much of what we have, all of that just comes from his own mother, and she recounted it after his death. Do you think she was biased at all? It isn't until he begins treasure digging with other people that we get corroborating accounts of who Joe really was. The good little boy of Lucy Mack Smith's biographical sketches is betrayed by people who'd been burned by Joe's clever wit and, of course, his lack of work ethic. He became a bit of a pariah during his treasure digging days, which all happened during the time he later claimed that he was communicating with angels. Throughout this time, Joe was repeatedly cited as quite intemperate and a fighter and drunk all the time. All the Smith boys had irregular income as hired hands when they couldn't land a treasure digging contract. Soon, Joe claimed to have the gold plates. Now, I know what I'm discussing so far. This is probably just rehearsing information that you all know, but this is the groundwork needed to understand the rest of the mountain peaks that we'll be skimming today. Finally, Joseph got the plates in episode 9. He got them home after supposedly running through the woods with them tucked under his arm and fending off multiple attackers. And, there's a lot of conjecture because it was all recounted by him. There were no witnesses. Nobody knows who the attackers might be. And needless to say, Joseph is quite biased of his own history. Joe kept digging himself deeper into his own bad reputation. Episodes 10 through 14 is where we discussed extensively the name that he was making for himself. And then finally, Sidney Rigdon enters our timeline in episode 14. So let me just really quickly talk Rigdon authorship of the Book of Mormon for a minute here. So the prevailing theory for how the Book of Mormon was written until B.H. Roberts in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, he successfully put the theory down, but that theory was that Rigdon had stolen a manuscript from a dead guy, Solomon Spaulding. Now, any expose or so-called anti-Mormon book for the entirety of the 19th century addresses the Spaulding-Rigdon authorship and claims that it's the most reasonable solution for the Book of Mormon. What that means is, if you were to ask anybody who knew anything about Mormonism in the 19th century where they thought the Book of Mormon came from, almost without fail, they'd say it came from a manuscript that Sidney Rigdon stole. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of convincing evidence and arguments are made that Rigdon wrote the Book of Mormon and then published it through Joseph Smith in order to create a degree of separation between him and the Spaulding manuscript. Some people even go so far as to claim that the unnamed angel that Joe met every year in the woods was actually Sidney Rigdon while he was working on the Book of Mormon manuscript. Maybe the angel was a spirit that Rigdon was channeling through occult ritualism. Maybe it wasn't actually a divine messenger. Seems kind of hard to believe. Maybe it was just a later creation, and none of it really happened, but it was just fabricated by Joseph to give the Book of Mormon divine origins. There's a ton of conjecture when Rigdon enters the timeline pre-1830. Where the Rigdon authorship theory can't be currently substantiated is getting the manuscript from Rigdon to Joseph's hands. That, and there are multiple accounts from David Whitmer, John Whitmer, and Emma Hale Smith that they would see Joe with his head buried in a hat for hours at a time without reading any manuscript. However, once again, their motivations for making those claims, they should be readily apparent. I shouldn't have to discuss them, that they had vested interests in making sure that the Book of Mormon remained as a divine connection from Joseph Smith. The simple fact is that no historian can place Joe and Rigdon in the same place at the same time, which would allow them to have collaborated. Personally, I don't see this as a major hurdle, right? We don't have GPS tracking of either of these guys, and both of their timelines throughout the 1820s have plenty of holes in them, which would allow for them to meet. Even if they themselves never met, their assistants, Parley Pratt and Oliver Cowdery, are almost completely absent from the historical record prior to 1829. Really, there are plenty of holes in the Rigdon authorship theory. However, they aren't necessarily completely unsurmountable hurdles. It's just interesting to note, and it's something that more people should be familiar with, the history and the evidence behind it. But with that said, regardless of the explanatory power of the Rigdon authorship theory, even if he didn't steal the Spaulding manuscript, the theory does require conspiracy among people, which makes it immediately suspect, especially when the conspiring individuals are the prophet of the church and his first counselor in the presidency. You kind of get where people wouldn't want to postulate such horrific and atrocious acts on the prophet of the church. The broad realm of Mormon historians today regard the Spaulding authorship theory and the Rigdon authorship as a fringe theory. With that said, you can listen to episodes 14 through 17 and the 7.5-hour Book of Mormon Motherlode episode in order to get a cursory rundown of the Rigdon authorship theory. The first year of the Church of Christ, that's what Joseph called it when he first started it, that's the year 1830. It was a tough one for Joe. He dealt with multiple arrests, dissent, Hiram Page using his own cedar stone to give revelation from the devil, apparently. Joe was forcibly removed from Colesville, New York. A local reporter stole the Book of Mormon manuscript and printed a satire calling Joe an ignoramus in the local newspaper in Palmyra. And of course, at this time, the first missionary troop made their way to Jackson County, Missouri, after a quick stop in Kirtland, Ohio, when they baptized Sidney Rigdon. That's all episodes 20 through 24, if you want to go back. After Rigdon and Edward Partridge visited Joe in New York, Joe and Emma decided it best to move the church and themselves to Kirtland, Ohio. Joe gave a revelation that everybody should sell or rent out their property in New York and move with them to Kirtland, or to the land westward, Missouri, where Zion was soon to be declared. Now, what's interesting is Joe met a lot of fertile soil in Kirtland, the people, were quite receptive to his new message. Well, of course, with mixed results. But a lot of really strange things began to happen out in Kirtland when Joe first arrived. Episodes 25 and 26, they go through various power grabs that Joe made along with the various new people he made friends with for various reasons. Newell Whitney, Edward Partridge, John Johnson, and a bunch of other wealthy converts were quickly elevated to high ranks within the church. And then, of course, at this same time, John Whitmer was given the office of first official church historian. Brigham Young, he finally enters the Mormon sphere in this time in 1832. And we went through a brief overview of his life prior to joining the church, then how he converted, and then what positions he was given up to his induction into the Brotherhood. That was episode 27, when Brigham makes his dramatic debut into our historical timeline. Mormonism waxes complicated as the years progress into the mid-1830s. Joe works with Sidney Rigdon to write the new translation of the Bible, write the Book of Moses, create the lectures on faith to be used in the School of the Prophets. And, those lectures were, it could be argued that they were done to distinguish Mormon theology from Campbellite theology. And, most of the Kirtland Rigdonites, prior to converting to Mormonism, they adhered to Campbellite theology. Well, more Rigdon's special version of Campbellite theology. All during this time, the church in Missouri continues to grow larger as the gathering place for Zion. Now, what is interesting is eventually the Missouri church, it was run by Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmers. It would be larger than the Kirtland church. Estimations of, population numbers, actual believing, irregular attending Mormons at this time, they vary as to when the Missouri membership became larger than the Kirtland membership. But by 1834 or 35, that's a pretty conservative estimate that the Missouri membership overtook that of Kirtland. Now, also keep in mind during this time that the church wasn't run by a central body the way it is today. It was established with Joseph Smith as prophet, seer, and revelator of the church. Each stake of Zion had its own leadership body who directly oversaw their local church, but they sort of only indirectly worked with the leadership in Kirtland. The leadership in Missouri, they published their own news articles, while the Kirtland body published their own proprietary periodical. But it also needs to be noted, Joe was still the keystone of it all. He was on the top of the pyramid. Now, this was made apparent when the Mormons were kicked out of Jackson County, Missouri, and Joe decided it was a good time to march 1,000 armed Mormons the 1,000 miles to liberate the territory and, quote-unquote, restore Zion, whatever that means. The army ended up being just over 200 guys. Lofty expectations. Unfortunately, they were dashed, and there were also nearly a dozen women and children to, help with the feeding of the group and everything. So this camp of men, they marched out to Missouri with no plans, not enough provisions or ammunition to wage any sort of war, and only a small number of commanding officers who even had any kind of military training. It was ill-fated from the beginning. This military march came to be known as Zion's Camp because that's all it was. A camping trip with like a dozen people dying from cholera. It was horrible. Now, I did have on the illustrious David Michael for episodes 30 and 31, where we covered Zion's Camp from top to bottom. Now, from that time on, Joe becomes more militant and political. Maybe even to his own detriment. And we'll kind of be covering that up to where we get to today and moving forward. Because the rest of the 1830s change after Zion's Camp. Joe does spend more time dealing with politics, dealing with money. Now, after Zion's Camp, Kirtland Mormonism becomes radically more intense and more complicated. This is at a time when Joseph had various, let's just say, accusations lobbed against him that he was practicing polygamy of some sort and that the Mormons were a free love sect. And as a result of that, they published what became Doctrine and Covenants Section 101, known as the Monogamy Revelation. That was later excised by Brigham Young and taken out of the Brighamite Doctrine and Covenants, but it still remained in the RLDS Doctrine and Covenants. But, of course, it was replaced by Doctrine and Covenants Section 132 in 1852 when it was read over the pulpit that Mormons are practicing polygamy. Of course, that was a revelation given in July of 1843. But what did happen around the same time was that Joseph was, he had Fanny Alger living as a housemaid in the Joseph Smith home with Emma and with their kids and with, other people that would occasionally stay with them, whether they were, destitute people or whatever they needed to stay with the Smiths for a little while. And Fanny Alger at this time was, she moved in when she was 14, 15 years old. She was 16 when finally she was outed, and it became widely known that Joseph and Fanny were having an affair. This is supposedly when Emma caught them in the barn. Now, there was just a lot going on at this time. Add into that, Joseph had just acquired ancient Egyptian papyri that he claimed to be the Book of Abraham, written by Abraham's own hand. So a lot of things are kind of converging together and making Mormonism more unique and also more radical, distinguishing them apart from any other religious sect at the time. Finally, in episode 34, that's when we covered the Kirtland Temple dedication. Now, I called this Kirtland Temple hallucination because when I was reading through the accounts, I just said that it sounds like drugs, and it absolutely does when you read through the accounts yourself and listen to that episode, and you'll hear what I mean by that. Of course, it was soon after that Cody Nakoni, my research partner for the Smith entheogen theory, got in touch with me, and we discussed extensively how entheogens influenced Mormonism. We'll get into that a little bit later, but if you want to, just to have an entire rundown of that and to get a little ear on where our research has recently led us, you can go listen to episode 10 of the Glassbox podcast. I actually had on Cody right before we went and did our presentation at Sunstone here in Seattle, and we just went through a little bit of psychedelics in Mormonism. We talked about Prop 2. There's just a lot of really good information there as well. And we also went on to Fred M. Smith, prophet of the RLDS Church, beginning in 1915 or 1916, who openly experimented with peyote. It's quite interesting. Just go give it a listen. Anyway, so to get back into our high-level overview here, during the Kirtland Temple dedication, it was a highly polarizing event. So there were a lot of Mormons who had incredible ecstatic and spiritual experiences, who were converted that day and never turned their backs, never ever turned their backs on Mormonism or on Joseph Smith. However, there were a number of people who thought that the whole thing at that time was a yarn, that it was just all Joseph was, let's just say he was endowing people with wine. William E. McClellan at this time, we call him Professor Bill in our timeline, of course. William E. McClellan had basically apostatized around this time, or he was murmuring against the church. And he said at a later time that there was no endowment that day except it was with wine. So there were definitely some people who recognized that there was nothing spiritual going on so much as people just feeling the spirits that were infused into the liquor. Moving on from that, we get into Joseph was really terrible with money, right? So building the Kirtland Temple ran Joseph and the Mormons into absolute destitution. Now, at this time, it depends on who's making the estimate, but Fawn Brody claimed that they were about $60,000 in debt. That is a substantial amount of money. That is more than $1 million in 2017 money. That's a lot of money, right? Especially for one small religious sect to be indebted to various creditors, and all of it was in Joseph's own name. He hadn't incorporated the church itself. So he was terrible with money, and he was driving the Mormons further into debt. A lot of things confluenced into 1836, early to mid 1836, and this is where there were enough Mormons who were frustrated with Joseph Smith that he went on a convenient little treasure digging trip in Massachusetts. He caught wind that there was some buried treasure in a nice old widow's backyard, and that he would be able to acquire it if he just went out to Massachusetts with some of his trusted brethren. He made the trip. It was all for naught. They didn't unearth the treasure. They thought that they had acquired it. They ended up just staying, I believe it was a month and a half in Massachusetts, and then making their way back home. What is interesting, and now this is all covered in episode 35, just to let everybody know. Then what is interesting with this too is the Kirtland Safety Society was contrived around this same time, and this is covered in episode 36. And in addition to that was the Brother of Gideon Society. Now, the Kirtland Safety Society was the bank that the Mormons started. They printed their own, quote-unquote rag money that was used in hopes to answer some of the debts. But it was a speculative venture, and a lot of Mormons cashed in their life savings in exchange for these Kirtland Safety Society notes. And then when the economy collapsed in 1837, needless to say, a lot of people lost their money, and they were not very pleased with Joseph Smith. But what this did lead to as well, because of all of these debts and everything, putting so much pressure on Joseph Smith, when he was on his way back from Massachusetts, the Quorum of the 12 actually contrived an assassination attempt. I covered this in episode 37, but Brigham Young, expressing his loyalty to Joseph Smith, actually rode out of Kirtland to meet Joseph on his way back to warn him of the assassination attempt, thus saving Joseph's life. It's really impressive. But once he got back to Kirtland, he still had a lot to deal with. Now, at this time, there's a guy named Grandison Newell. He was in the process of suing Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon because he was one of the many, many creditors who Joseph owed money to. He was suing them, and Joseph decided it was best to have him assassinated. Now, there's a lot of conjecture about whether or not Joseph commanded this, whether or not it actually happened, but there were affidavits sworn out in court when Joseph was arrested and was forced to appear in court that there were two men that waited outside of Grandison Newell's house late at night and tried to assassinate him. He survived the attempt, and of course lived to tell the tale in court under a sworn testimony. It's important to note that this is the level this is a time when Joseph seems to make a shift. He has a lot of pressure. A lot of people are demanding money from him. He had lost a lot of people's monies and had just played with it. He had lived high on the hog from the Mormons and their hard-earned money, and now he was suffering those repercussions. However, this gets a little bit rough because after that happens, Joe and Rigdon finally are chased out of town. Now, when they leave, the 3-story building that was behind the Kirtland Temple was actually a judge in Kirtland ruled that it should be transferred to one of the creditors. It was not Grandison Newell, it was another creditor, but likely somebody who was friends with Grandison Newell. Rich people who lend out money freely, they tend to run in similar circles. Apparently, when this 3-story building was transferred, as Joseph and Sidney Rigdon were leaving town, that place caught fire. And there was a later account from the son of a man named Lyman Sherman who claimed it was his father who lit it on fire. Lyman Sherman was a faithful member until the day he died. So there's just a lot going on. This really marks a change in Joseph Smith's view of what he is doing. Whether or no, we can't get inside the mind of Joseph Smith, but we can make inferences and, maybe even assumptions based on his actions. Where before he was delivering sermons and he was building temples, now he is burning buildings down because, out of spite? He didn't want the building to come into the possession of his enemies. He's fleeing town and completely relocating himself because the people in his own church were trying to kill him. That hadn't happened before. Now, when he had fled New York for Kirtland, he was fleeing because it was his old business partners, his old treasure digging company who wanted a piece of the gold plates, but he had, screwed them out of so much money that they wanted a piece of him or of the plates. So he was chased out by them. It was the exodus from Kirtland to Missouri that marked when the Mormons themselves, when the Mormon leadership were hostile enough towards Joseph Smith that he was no longer safe. Also worth noting, around the same time, that Warren Parrish and a very small group of Parishites, actually, declared that Joseph Smith was in opposition to the will of God. They stormed into the Kirtland Temple during one of the Sundays that Joseph wasn't there, and they took over the church with Bowie knives and pistols. A scuffle ensued, a gun discharged, maybe a couple of guns discharged. I'm blanking on the details at the moment. A riot ensued, a big fight happened, and the constable had to arrest 20 men. Right, this is not the Mormonism that we picture. This is the real early Mormonism. It's a lot more controversial, and it was a lot more, a lot less homogenous than we may view it through our, presentist lens. When we get to Missouri, things really take a radical shift. This is when we get into Rigdon's July 4th oration. Now, a lot of pressures had happened that, swore out the Danite Manifesto that said that the Whitmers and Cowdery had to leave town within 48 hours or they would be dealt with by the Danites. The Danites themselves were actually formed. The Brother of Gideon Society was the underground police force that was served to be the prototype for this Danite troop of, underground enforcers. And a lot of things are just accelerating. So when Joseph held this cleansing in Missouri, once he got out there, a lot of really good people who may have served to moderate the church or to keep it within the realm of mainstream Christianity more, they were all excised. What was left was the most radical and eccentric Mormons, all under the leadership of the most radical and eccentric Mormons, Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon. Rigdon gives his July 4th oration. That ignites the powder keg that was Missouri. Missouri and Mormons from when they first started moving in late 1830 and early 31, they had a complicated past for many reasons. A lot of it fueled by racism. A lot of it fueled by tribalism of just not liking another group of people moving in. A lot of it fueled by economics and the how incredibly cheap land was out there and the Mormons squatting on the land and not paying bills. There were just a lot of pressures happening that complicated the relationship between the Missourians and the Mormons. When Joe and Rigdon show up, they accelerate that. They pour kerosene on this fire and really ignite it and get everything even more excited and broiling. Now, the entire Missouri conflict is so complicated, and Missouri grows to a fever pitch, and this is episodes 44 through 49. Rigdon's July oration, that was episode 43. 44 through 49, that's where we go through the entire conflict, the history of the Missouri Mormon War. Episode 48, that is the ubiquitously known Hans Mill Massacre. Knowing the history of everything that led up to the Hans Mill Massacre, it seemed almost like an inevitability. But there's nothing that will excuse what happened. It was unacceptable. It was horrible. And unfortunately, because it was horrible, it has played into the Mormon persecution narrative ever since it happened, which even more excited people. Moving on to that, we had the Court of Inquiry. Now, the Court of Inquiry was quite a challenge because there was a lot of documentation that was gathered in investigating what happened in Missouri between the Mormons and the Missourians. But because Joseph and the leadership escaped Liberty Jail and they never faced the consequences or they never faced a proper jury trial, the documentation, extensive investigation and discovery never happened. And they were never convicted. They were never sent to the gallows as they legally deserved to be. So the Court of Inquiry, that was episode 50. It was a monster. Moving on to the Mormon exodus from Missouri to Illinois, that is an extremely complex time in Mormon history. That's also the time when Joseph and Sidney Rigdon, Hyrum Smith, and a number of other Mormon elites are all locked up in Liberty Jail and another jail where there were, a couple dozen other Mormons that were locked up. It's a very complex time. That's episodes 51 through 53. But then we have episodes 54 through 56 is where something remarkable happens. Joseph Smith begins writing his own history. He begins dictating his own history that would soon be published in the 1842 in the Times and Seasons. Soon after that, you'll actually, if you, something I was referring to earlier with the Kirtland Temple dedication ceremony, episodes 59 through 60, that's where Cody and I actually read through our Sunstone paper that details the Sunstone, the Smith entheogen theory, in totality, from top to bottom, reading the paper. So those were a couple of just standalone episodes, but getting back into the historical timeline. Now, this is interesting because the shifts that Joseph Smith made towards militarism and totalitarian control in Missouri, it's almost like he learned his lesson from his year there in Missouri and his 5-month stint in Liberty Jail. Because when he gets out to Illinois, that's when Joseph reduces his militaristic leanings and instead moves towards more political motivations. This is when he compiles affidavits from dozens of Mormons and compiles them all into a folder and meets with the President of the United States and asks for $1.2 million in reparations for the Missouri Exodus. Now, I covered all of this in episode 58. Joseph Smith called President Martin Van Buren a fop or a fool without parts. His description was quite hilarious, and it's worth noting that that description was actually excised from the documentary history of the church. It was only through reading the Dan Vogel restored history of the church that I was able to find that passage. Now, what moves on after that is even more complicated because John C. Bennett finally enters the timeline in episode 62. Okay, let's pause. Just take a minute to consider the episode numbers here. Okay, today is episode 130. Bennett entered the timeline in episode 62. It took us 62 episodes to cover roughly 35 years of Joseph Smith's history, but Nauvoo is so insanely complicated that it's taken us the next 60 episodes to progress another 2 years. Now, I should say that I could have taken that long to cover Kirtland and Missouri history, but to be honest, I had no idea what I was doing 2 years ago leading up to the Nauvoo period. The shift around episodes 50 to 60 is where I stopped telling you about popular Mormon history and started digging in much deeper and studying the history the way historians do. There's a subtle difference between the two approaches, but it's a difference that's important. One approach describes what historians have spent over a century constructing. The other takes what historians have been constructing for over a century and builds on that body of knowledge. Now, hopefully that explains the massive disparity between the pacing that we used to do as opposed to our current pacing through the historical timeline. That and Nauvoo is just inherently more complex in every possible way. Any Mormon historian anywhere on the belief spectrum will agree that Nauvoo is the most complex and radical time of the Joseph era of Mormonism. And from my own personal perspective, after studying what they've been studying for over a century, I see why that's just an axiomatic truth of Mormon history. And the documentary history of the church illustrates this very well when we see that volumes 1 through 3 cover 32 years from 1805 to 1837, while volumes 4 through 7 are twice the size nearly of the 1 through 3 volumes, and they cover just 6 years between 1838 and 44. Nauvoo is just that intense. Add into that, you had thousands of converts moving in, right? Get into that in a second. So to reflect back on what I was saying earlier, John Bennett, his influence on Mormonism was immediately felt in Nauvoo government, which is to also say Nauvoo Mormon leadership, right? Because Nauvoo government and Nauvoo church leadership were inextricably tied. They were basically the same body of people. Bennett started pulling all kinds of strings. He got the Nauvoo Charter passed, which created all sorts of amazing provisions to turn Nauvoo into the burgeoning theocracy it would soon become. Now, I read through the entire charter on episode 66. If you want to listen to it and, understand what each provision in the charter really means, you got to listen to that top to bottom. But an underlying theme throughout nearly all of Mormon history is the complete and utter destitution of Joseph Smith and the Mormons at large. Now, what I mean by that is, let me preface this. We went through a bit of the financial strains on episode 72, but Nauvoo itself was built purely on speculation, okay? The Mormon elite knew for a fact that Nauvoo would become the next big population center on the Mississippi, while non-Mormon land speculators suddenly saw thousands of refugees moving near their land as a prime opportunity to capitalize on others' misfortunes. It's extremely complicated. And when you understand the complex financial history of the time, well, it puts into context a lot more of what happened throughout 1844 and 45, especially with the death of Joseph Smith. That is stuff we'll be covering extensively in the future. Now, another major shift that happens is the Temple Cornerstone Ceremony with the Nauvoo Legion. Now, that was episode 77. Now, why that catalogs such a remarkable shift is because the Nauvoo Legion was created by the Nauvoo Charter, and at the time it was socially encouraged for cities to create their own militias because there weren't, federal police forces that could be distributed around. There were just state militias. So local county and city militias were actually encouraged. But what this did mark was the temple dedication ceremony was over 1,000 armed soldiers in uniform marching through the streets of Nauvoo in impressive military drills, all under the direction of Joseph Smith, who was vice mayor of the city, and John C. Bennett, who was major general, who was second in command of the army of the Nauvoo Legion to Joseph Smith, who was mayor of the town, who was also Joseph Smith's roommate. These two guys running absolutely everything. They had their own army. A lot of people stood up and took notice. This was terrifying to a lot of people, that somebody could be so powerful, who was just a religious despot. Moving from that, because this is all concomitant with this same time as all of these increased political motivations are happening, the doctrine and rampant practice of polygamy makes its debut in episodes 78 through 84. That's where I covered the entire history of polygamy versus monogamy in multiple religious and cultural traditions throughout most of human history. Of course, it was a very high level overview, and it's something that, it was just an overview of history that I haven't personally spent, decades researching like many people have. But hopefully it offered a bit of an idea of contextualizing what Mormon polygamy is and showing that it's not necessarily a complete anomaly in the human condition and that people have been practicing polygamy for just as long as we have written history. But of course, eventually that morphed into how Mormon polygamy works in Joseph Smith's time, and then how it ends up working out today. After that, of course, Joseph Smith is arrested again in episode 88. Now, that shouldn't be a surprise because he was arrested or appeared in court 32 times before he died. So by this point, it was blasé. But this was a notable time in the timeline because it marked the end of the Quorum of the Apostles' mission to Europe from 1839 to 1841. Now, I didn't mention this earlier when it actually started happening, but 39 to 41 was an important mission trip. Brigham Young had been extremely successful in Europe. He had shared multiple letters back and forth from Nauvoo to Liverpool, letting them know how successful he was. He'd established the Millennial Star printing press and periodical, which ran until 1971, more than 130 years. He also established the Immigration Fund. It was because of the Immigration Fund that Brigham Young became the success that he was in Utah. The Immigration Fund funneled tens of thousands of recent Mormon converts from Europe into the United States from the period of, from Brigham Young's initial rule, and we'll just cut it off arbitrarily at the Mormon Reformation period. But there were tens of thousands of Mormon converts from 1841 to 1857 that flooded into Nauvoo and Utah. And most of those converts did follow Brigham Young and the apostles out to the Utah territory. Without that immigration fund and, Brigham Young being the ledger watcher and bean counter that he was, without that immigration fund, Brigham Young may never have had the critical mass that he needed in order to allow the Utah theocracy to flourish. But because of that, because of the string of tens of thousands of converts flooding into the territory, he had the population to wage war with the natives and take over the territory and essentially exterminate them, if I'm using exterminate in the 19th century context. At the same time, we discussed the Book of Abraham that was published and the the Book of Mormon original manuscript that was buried in the Nauvoo House Corner episode. That was all in episode 99. That's when Joe was quoted saying that he's had enough trouble with this thing, referring to the original manuscript of the Book of Mormon. It's quite an interesting quote. Finally, episode 100. That's when we walked through Mormonism and Masonry with the introduction of the Quorum of the Anointed 7 weeks after Joe had ascended to Master Mason at sight. It's extremely complicated. Finally, we get into the Nauvoo Relief Society in episode 102. Episodes 103 through 106, that's the Book of Abraham. Now, the Book of Abraham was surprisingly more complex than initially thought, and the airtime completely got away from me on that, but it was still really fun to go through the historicity of it and be armed with the arguments that historians on both sides of the aisle are making about the Book of Abraham, even the very few believing Egyptologists who claim that the Book of Abraham is indeed translated from papyri that Joseph Smith supposedly purchased in 1835 from Michael Chandler. See, it all comes back around. It all comes back to something Joe did earlier. So finally, we moved on to Porter Rockwell attempted assassination of Lilburn Boggs. Now, what this really catalyzed was an entire shift once again in Mormonism. Joe was extremely powerful. He had a lot going on. He had a lot of politicians who were fawning over him and trying to get the Mormon voting bloc. He had a lot of money tossed around. He was living on nothing but speculation. He had a lot of friends. He had many more enemies. And finally, he had caused one of his childhood friends. He commanded, and there's some conjecture about this, but I truly believe it, that he commanded his good friend from old Palmyra days, Pistol Packin' Porter Rockwell, the destroying angel of Mormonism, to go assassinate an ex-governor of the state of Missouri who was at the time running for state senator. Now, Joe could, he could cause people to be put out of the way in Nauvoo, and they would not be heard from or seen from again. That was not a big deal. But assassinating a major high-ranking government official, that is a new bar. That is a new high or a new low. I don't know how you look at it, but that was something completely new. And that terrified a lot of people. Episodes 110 through 111, that's the temple ceremony exposés that we read through. A dramatized reading of those exposés. They're quite interesting. And then finally, we begin witnessing the turn of Joe and Bennett's relationship in episode 115. We've spent a lot of time on the impact of Bennett on Mormon history and the doctrine of polygamy. Rummaging in the fallout from the Bennett meltdown, that's where we've been ever since. So, there you go. So, I'm not sure what I was trying to do here. A high-level overview, getting airlifted out of the muck and the mud of the valleys of Mormonism so we can see the mountaintops. That's 4 years of covering Mormon history in a serial format, just summed up in a few minutes of riffing. Each one of those points that I mentioned takes hours to unpack. And really, that's why we've been so frequently lost in the valleys of Mormon history. And we occasionally have to take that airlift to get back out and see the mountain peaks, to see where we've been, and more importantly, to see what lies ahead. In the coming months and years, we have major developments to discuss. The increase of polygamy, the Kinderhook Blades, that's a fun one, doctrinal developments leading to the King Follett Discourse, tons and tons of political maneuvers, the increased expansion of the Mormon theocracy, the Council of 50, dissent and fracturing, schisms, the Nauvoo Expositor, Carthage, more schisms, infighting and underground militias exerting influence in horrible ways, the Battle of Nauvoo, and the Illinois militia takeover forcing the Brighamites out of Illinois. The completion of the Nauvoo Temple, the dedication of it, and the ordinances contained therein. The continued fracturing of a handful of disparate sects of Mormonism. And then we transition out of the Nauvoo era of Mormonism from 1845 to 1847. Yeah. In regards to judging long-dead people, there's a lot of cultural details, context, and thoughts missing. It's not a conclusive thing. Anti-Mormonism churns out plausibilities like fan fiction. The variations are endless, but do not cite evidence from original sources. Go to those original sources cited in all anti-Mo lit and see if they're cited correctly or in context. That's where most of the fails are. Do you ever hear stuff like this parroted about? Or is it just me who follows people with whom I disagree? Look, if you've listened to every episode in the backlog, I hope you realize the absurdity of those quotes like what I just now read. If you're just nodding along the whole episode with everything that I just reviewed, if this was all old information to you, then you know more Mormon history than almost any person sitting in sacrament meeting every Sunday. Everything in Mormonism happens within the context of the people and time in which it took place. To learn Mormon history without the context is a major disservice to the people who lived it and a disservice to the complex and fascinating field of Mormon history academia. Unfortunately for us all, though, so many conversations about Mormon history devolve to a Mormon and an anti-Mormon slugging it out with quick arguments and claimed refutations of those arguments, but neither party is working with the same body of knowledge, and they often refuse to ever meet each other eye to eye. Think back on everything today. At any point did I say such and such was an argument for why the church is or isn't true? Did I say anything about the theology or doctrine beyond just when specific doctrines or practices were implemented? Whether or not the church is true is such a useless conversation when it's exchanged in the towering shadow of Mormon history academia. If I had to apply an analogy, it's arguing whether Mac or Android is better while never acknowledging how cool it is to have unlimited information at our fingertips delivered by a handheld device with thousands of times the processing power of the standard at-home computer from 20 years prior. It's also like Mac, Android, the argument's long settled. But whether or not Mormonism is true is the most useless conversation to have. But at the same time, it's the most important conversation to most people who talk about Mormonism in general. For the last 4 years, I've sought to provide you not with the arguments about why the truth claims of Mormonism are false, but with the information for you to make your own arguments about Mormon history, should you need it. And if that information happens to entertain you along the way, then I guess mission accomplished, right? This show isn't created to give you a spearhead argument your Mormon coworker or loved one throws out there after reading an article by Dan Peterson. This show is created to give you a tactical nuke of information. You decide how best to use it. Or, dismantle the nuke and use the fissile material to generate your own information. I mean, you're all smart. That's the thing is, the correspondence I get every week from so many of you and all of the links that you guys send me, and, it shows that you're a smart audience. You know what's going on. You know Mormon history. So yeah, this episode is essentially a 4-year anniversary episode. A little, masturbatory navel gazing felt a little bit in order after 4 years, but doing so in a way that it can be a useful resource to you if you're searching for that one thing in Mormon history you can't remember when or where it happened, right? Besides, there's a handy-dandy little search bar at the nakedmormonismpodcast.com, courtesy of $49sites.com, where you can search the entire backlog of episodes, which includes the show notes as well, to find exactly what you're looking for. My hope is this. When you happen to get a conversation about a single topic within Mormon history, whether that's a specific sermon that Joseph Smith gave, the particulars of the Sarah Pratt affair, what the original temple ceremony looked like and its similarities and differences with contemporary Masonic rituals, I hope you can scour your memory banks for the content and context of that subject. And if you can't seem to remember what the real subject and real information is that you're working with, tell the person that you're not informed enough about the subject, come back and listen to the episode, then return to the conversation at a later time armed with the relevant information and your own thoughts and arguments about it. As a serial history, I hope this is entertaining and informative. As a source to reference for yourself or to send people to, I hope it's useful for those purposes. And I guess I'll close by saying, engage only in conversations that are worth having, people. You'll save your sanity by doing so. With all of that said, I hope you all had an awesome Thanksgiving, and for our non-American listeners, I hope you had an awesome week, I guess. We'll get back into the wasteland of the Bennett Meltdown next week, continuing in late August of 1842. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager, Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer, and Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres as legal counsel. Music is provided by Jason Comeau of aloststateofmind.com and used with permission. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC, copyright 2018, all rights reserved.